Good evening, my name is Leanna Davis, and I will be doing a small presentation on Daniel Defoe. We know him as a children's author who wrote Robinson Crusoe, but he did write many other novels besides that, and we're going to learn about some other things that he wrote that he was actually very well known for at the time of when he wrote them. I do apologize if there's any barking in the background. I do have two very protective dogs, and I don't live in that quiet of a neighborhood. It is also freezing cold in my house, so if you see me shiver or pace, I'm just very cold. I have no heat in my house. So, in the life of Daniel Defoe, he was born in 1660 in London, England, and he lived till 1731. Well, in England, he was born into a nonconformist family, which at the time was just a fancy name for a Protestant family. His father was nonconformist, and he was not Catholic. That was pretty much all that meant. So his father's name was James Foe, and we're going to learn a little bit later about why Daniel's called Daniel Defoe instead of Daniel Foe. He traded in brick and tile in Tilbury, or near Tilbury, and in the latter part of his life, his trade of interest was politics. We're going to discuss a little bit in the interesting facts how he got into those politics later. He married Mary Tilbury, his wife, who bore him 8 total children. On my PowerPoint, it says 6, and we're going to learn the interesting fact about the other 2. Kind of sad. You might already know what's coming. So another fact about his life that is good to know is that after his business collapsed, a friend named Robert Harley kind of bailed him out, gave him some money, and got him a position in politics, which is where he really was well known. After 47 years to his wife, Defoe died first on April 24th, a day after my birthday, in 1731, quite a ways before I was born though, at the ripe age of 71 years old. Some interesting facts about Daniel Defoe. Number 1, his name was Daniel Foe. In his 30s, he decided to change it to Defoe. He liked that sound more. It sounded more gentlemanly to him. Another interesting fact about Daniel Defoe is that he actually went bankrupt during his life. Most people don't even realize that when they think of Daniel Defoe. They think of a quiet writer. Well, he actually went bankrupt for, in English terms, £17,000 in 1692. In today's equivalent standard, that is $3.6 million. That's a lot of money to go bankrupt on. Another interesting fact about Daniel Defoe was that his wife had given birth to 2 other children as well, so a total of 8. However, those 2 children didn't make it to adulthood. So when we think of the children that Daniel Defoe did have, we normally think of the 6 that did survive. Daniel Defoe took a turn into politics. Now, remember that friend Robert Harley that we talked about? Robert Harley made a bargain with him and kind of bailed him out when his family was in some financial difficulty. And he said, how about this? I will get you a position into politics. So Daniel Defoe, interestingly enough, people think of him as a novel writer, and I want you to think about the fact he also wrote in politics, and that's going to come up in some of the things that were about his writings. When you look at his writings in the critique, he deals a lot with Negroes and slavery and racism in some of his books, and he was actually very politically active in writing about that. So much so that you can see on the PowerPoint, he actually got in trouble for some of it. So unfortunately, we have freedom of speech here. It was not so where he was in England, so he could actually get arrested for some of the things he said, and he did. The first recognized political pamphlet that he had was published in 1683, and Defoe became King William III's leading pamphleteer during his reign. That was a pretty big accomplishment. So he basically was the political agenda person of the day. These pamphlets were circulated all throughout England as a way of communication. So think about a newspaper or a magazine that comes out, well, not really a magazine, but think about those daily newsletters that come from someone's blog or their blog or something like that. Those would be considered what these pamphlets were to King William. So what those blogs are to us, what the person's going to write on the next day, that was what his pamphlet was to the people. And he was so good at it that he became King William III's leading pamphleteer. He published The True-Born Englishman in 1701 to attack the new king who came on the throne after King William III. However, it didn't land so well with him, and he actually got put in prison for it's a term called seditious libel. What that means is it's basically slander. So he said some not very nice things, and people who didn't like what he said put him in prison for it. Fortunately, in America, we don't have that problem today, although we should still be respectful of our leaders. He wrote The Shortest Way with the Dissenters in 1702. So after he published The True Born Englishman, keep in mind these are all pamphlets, not novels yet. The Shortest Way with the Dissenters in 1702, he used irony to denounce basically all of the highborn people in the church. They were called high flyers, and they were wealthy people in the church, people who had good standing and who could make good use of their life, but all they wanted to do was just sit in the church and say, oh, well, I'm a Protestant, so I'm just going to sit here. So anyway, he used that pamphlet to mock them, and a couple of his pamphlets also were not as nice or as gracious as we would probably say things today in the Christian world. So because of that, he was arrested in May of 1703 under the term seditious libel, which simply means slander or not so nice speech. So in those days, you could say something about the king and you could get killed for it if it was negative. Whereas here, we could say something that we don't like about somebody, and we know that they're not going to hunt us down and kill us over it. Another interesting fact about him is the hymn to Pillory. So remember how we talked about the fact that he was always getting arrested? So his people, his opponents in the political realm who didn't like what he wrote, a lot of times he mentioned very clearly racism, and he mentioned the fact that he was treated different and that he noticed the difference in classes. So a poem, this was a poem, the hymn to the Pillory, and he actually wrote it, hymn to the Pillory, as a kind of like a tribute to where he was sentenced 3 different times in the city of Pillory. So that's another interesting fact of one of his works. Another one of his works was An Appeal to Honor and Justice. This was a written work detailing his experiences and the consequences he suffered for his questionable actions. So think of Defoe as viewing himself as someone who was persecuted for speaking truth. And in a way he was. He denounced a lot of what the leaders and the Catholics had going on those days. However, keep in mind, at the same time, when we address our elders, we're to do it in a Christian manner and in a kind way. And yet he took these pamphlets as an opportunity to just slash and cut people down with them. So again, he was put in prison before, and he went ahead and wrote this An Appeal to Honor and Justice, saying, why can't I point out these things that are wrong? Why can't I, if I do this and I get in trouble, what? So he wrote this as a record of all the times he got in trouble. So that was an interesting fact about that one. After his business failed, he negotiated with Harley. Well, rather, Harley negotiated with Defoe to use his services as a pamphleteer. So that's how he got started. He was actually put into office by Harley, so he contributed most of his success to David Harley, because Harley was the one who got him started in that. So then he started writing pamphlets for a while. He took a break when he got to Robinson Crusoe, and we'll talk about Robinson Crusoe in a little bit. Tour Through the Whole Island of Great Britain, Volume 1, 2, and 3 was another thing he wrote. Again, obviously on what it sounds like, Tour Through the Whole Island of Great Britain. And the last one is The Review, that he's known for this one as well. The Review was an extended periodical, so think of periodicals, a magazine. It was an extended periodical that was published from 1704 to 1713, so 9 years long, during the reign of Queen Anne. And this was basically, he was the sole not the sole author. He had a couple under him as authors who helped. But for the main part, he was the one who wrote this. He's known for writing this. And it was to keep people updated on the latest news, similar to today's newspaper. So some critiques of things that he wrote would be, he was very strong in a lot of his... I apologize. He was very strong in a lot of his writing. His plots can be clear but confusing at times. He did write using Old English, and so if you don't read an abridged version or a revised version that is good for children, it can be confusing when you read it to a younger child. Now, Robinson Crusoe is his most well-known book. He wrote other ones such as the later adventures of Robinson Crusoe, or Captain Singleton, or the I'm blanking on the word. Captain Singleton is a book about a boy who was stolen from his family by a gypsy, and then he grew up and he became a pirate. And that was probably one of the things that I found most about his writings, is oftentimes he glorified the sin. So most of the book of Captain Singleton was on this guy being a pirate, him raiding people, all the thrill of the chase of him killing natives in this place, enslaving them, which, keep in mind, think about the fact that Defoe talked about racism. Yet in his books, he does mention racism, and a lot of times he's not in favor for it, as you can tell by the way he writes, but he still does include it as part of the culture because that was the culture he grew up in. A couple other things that I would note is that his themes often had morality choices that the main characters had to make. His point of view was written from first person perspective, and I find that it's useful when I'm reading it to a child to say, because he's writing saying, I saw this, I had to make this thing to the child. So what would you have done? So when you read it to a kid, to a child, in my viewpoint, a lot of times you do have to filter out some of he wasn't very clean in his language or in some of the things that he wrote about, and so you do have to filter those out for a child. However, it was also it's a good way, especially Robinson Crusoe, since it was written from a guy who did become saved at the end. It's very much a good opportunity for the child to use those thinking skills to incorporate it into their life. Anyway, I'm going to start reading from Robinson Crusoe. Those are just some fun facts about his life, some of his works. He was known a lot for his pamphlets, but today we normally remember him for the one book, Robinson Crusoe. He did write other books as well. But again, I would caution when reading them to children, simply because of you would need to go through and read it first and censor things out. So today, we're going to read an excerpt from the very beginning of Robinson Crusoe. Now, I want you to think, what would happen if you got stranded in the middle of nowhere? What would you do? Well, this story is about someone from a very long time ago who got stranded. Now, I want you to think as we read this book, what do you think he's going to do? This is written in first person, so I'm going to read it like I am actually Robinson Crusoe. I was born in the year 1632 in the city of York, of a good family, though not of that country, my father being a foreigner of Bremen, who settled first at Hull. He got a good estate by merchandise, and leaving off his trade, lived afterward at York, from whence he married my mother, whose relations were named Robinson, a very good family in that country, and from whom I was called Robinson Crutzen. But by the usual corruption of words in England, we are now called, nay, we call ourselves and write our name Crusoe, and so my companions always called me. Now we know how Robinson Crusoe has gotten his name. Being the third son of the family and not bred to any trade, my head began to be filled very early with rambling thoughts. I would be satisfied with nothing but going to sea, and my inclination to this led me so strongly against the will, nay, the commands of my father, and against all the entreaties and persuasions of my mother and other friends, that there seemed to be something fatal in that propensation of nature tending directly to the life of misery which was to befall me. Propensation in that sentence simply means the provision of nature. So he, before he was saved, didn't believe in God. So he's just thinking that nature is calling him to this. My father, a wise and grave man, gave some serious and excellent counsel against what he foresaw was my design. He called me one morning into his chamber and expostulated, meaning he talked very sternly, very, very sternly with me upon this subject. He asked me what reasons, more than a mere wandering inclination, I had for leaving my father's house and my native country, where I had a prospect of raising my fortune by application and industry. He's asking, why do you think it is a good idea to leave? And what I want you to think is, if you were going to leave your family to go out to sea, what would you tell your father if he decided to ask you why you would leave? We will find out what he says in our next lesson.